Chapter 11 Lazybones. Maddie wished it were only a dream from which she would awake in the pearly good morning and know that all was well. But it was no dream, and all was not well. It was no dream that their beautiful home was sold, and it was no dream that Jake was in New Mexico, possibly dying of pneumonia. And it was no dream that she, Mary, and Gidley were moving the last of their belongings to New Mexico by train. Tobe and Nettie, who were now married for several years, had 2 children. They, along with Dan and his new wife Polly, and Jake and Father, had moved to New Mexico several months earlier. Tobe's youngest child, 2-year-old Chris, had been too sick to go along then, so they decided he would travel with Mother later. But then plans changed. Jake became deathly ill with pneumonia, and Mother had to leave immediately to care for him. She had taken Lydia with her. This had left most of the work and responsibility upon Maddie, and she had not wanted to leave their home in Kansas in the first place. Sarah was married too, and she and Ammon were staying in Kansas, so it had been doubly hard to leave, not knowing when they would see Sarah again. Word had spread of the inexpensive land that could be bought in New Mexico and the bountiful crops being harvested there. Tobe, Dan, Jake, and Father were immediately interested and traveled there to investigate. They returned full of excitement and plans. Father sold their home and 80 acres. With that money, he completely paid for a whole section of virgin prairie, a whopping 640 acres. Of course, it was not cultivated or fenced and had no buildings on it. But Father was a carpenter, so this posed no problem for him. He would soon have houses built. Father firmly believed that the move there would be the best for his family. Mother had grave doubts, but bravely hoped Father was right. And Maddie, Mary, and Lydia also had doubts. But Father and the boys were absolutely certain all would be well in New Mexico. When Maddie, Giddle, Mary, and little Chris arrived in Springer, New Mexico, Father was waiting with a new horse and wagon. It had been a long and tiresome journey, especially for little Chris. Keeping the active toddler entertained had been no easy task. Now Chris leaped into his grandfather's arms. With a loud whoop, Maddie's father snatched him up and threw him high into the air, then caught him again. Chris giggled happily, and that joy banished the tiredness Maddie had felt only a short hour before. It was so good to see Father. "How's Jake?" Mary asked, almost before Father had time to catch his breath. Father swung Chris onto his shoulders and let a deep sigh escape his lips before answering. "He's doing better. We feel sure he'll make it now, but he's pretty weak. It will take a while for him to really get over this." His eyes were somber, and Maddie realized in a new way how serious Jake's illness had been. "It's a good thing Mother came when she did," he added. He set Chris down on the wide platform so he could help get their things out of the boxcar. Chris wanted to run in wide circles, but Maddie hung on to him. There were too many people around for monkey shines. Finally, the last of their boxes and crates were loaded on the wagon, and they began the 30-mile trek to their home. Maddie couldn't help staring at the awesome landscape they intended to call home. "Is this a place to live?" she murmured. "That's what I'd like to know," Mary said quietly. "Of course it's a place to live," Father exclaimed in his loud, booming voice. "Isn't it, Chris?" He squeezed his trusting grandson nestled in his lap. Chris giggled and nodded happily. All around to the south and east was flat, barren prairie without a landmark in sight. To the far, far west were mountains stretching as far as they could see, and to the north was a curious-looking mountain that rose straight up and was long and flat on top. Just to the east of it and a little farther north was another one that reminded Maddie of an elephant with his feet stuck in the ground. "Look at that mountain over there, Giddle. It looks like an elephant." The shape of an elephant's head and trunk were clearly visible. "It's called Elephant's Peak," Father told them. "And the other one you see that's long and flat is called Hogback." He pointed back toward Elephant's Peak and asked if they could see the strange-looking one that was a little behind and to the east of it. It resembled a straw stack with several smaller straw stacks clustered around it. "That's called the Seven Sisters." The prairie was wild and empty. Except for the distant mountains, there was nothing to be seen. No houses, no trees, not even a fence post. There was no sign of life anywhere, and Maddie began to wonder if they were the only living beings on the entire earth. "How do you know which way to go to get to our place?" she asked Father. "I just follow my nose," he answered. "But how does your nose know which way to go?" "It's been this way before." Maddie could only wonder and hope that Father would not get lost. The sun was setting in breathtaking, fiery colors, more beautiful than Maddie had ever seen. Wispy clouds flung thin wings carelessly up and outward, as though to take all the room in the great wide sky. Maddie looked up and up and up. The sky seemed so much larger than it had in Reno County, Kansas, even larger than what she remembered it was in Ford County. The air was dry and hot. Tiny stars peeked through the gathering dusk and shone straight at her. They did not twinkle by the wayside as they did in Kansas, but shone steady and clear. Suddenly she noticed a thin slice of the silvery moon suspended above the setting sun. "At least they have the same moon here," she mumbled to herself. Several hours later they arrived at a small adobe house. It was squatty and dingy. Maddie wondered who lived there. It did not occur to her that this was home. "This is Dan's house, but we're living here too until we get our house built," Father informed them. Maddie was shocked. She knew life would not be as it had been in Kansas, but she had expected more than this. The girls spent the night on the hard dirt floor just inside the door. It was warm and humid, with too many bodies in too tight quarters. Maddie dozed fitfully, never quite relaxing. Suddenly, she sat bolt upright. Almost at the same time, Mary sat up too. "What was that?" Mary whispered hoarsely. "I don't know." Something had awakened them, but neither knew what it had been. Suddenly, sharp yipping sounds filled the night air, and chills ran up their spines. The yips seemed to circle the small house and tremble through the open window, rising and falling and rising again, and then suddenly all was quiet. Maddie and Mary stared wide-eyed into the darkness. "What can it be?" Mary whispered. "I don't know. But it must not be too serious or the others would hear it too." "Should we wake Mother?" "No, she's tired, and it's probably nothing that will get us." Mary argued that it might be something dangerous, but after listening for a long time and hearing nothing more, she finally lay down again. The next time they heard the high yipping sounds, they came from much further away. Maddie was reassured that whatever was yipping, it was not dangerous. In a way, it was nice to know that they were not the only living beings in the world, even if the others were wild animals. The next morning dawned with a bright, hot sun bearing down on them. The prairie looked different in the daylight. The grasses were taller and the house seemed larger. Maddie was startled to see Jake, thin and pale, on the couch. He lay with eyes closed, and she wasn't sure if he was asleep or awake. But when he heard her taking up the quilts, he opened his eyes and smiled. "Welcome home," he gestured with a weak wave of his hand. "Home?" Maddie asked. Is this a place to live? Of course it's a place to live. Well, it sure isn't home like we're used to. Give us time. How do you feel? I just need a little rest and then I'll be all right again. He raised himself onto his elbow and smoothed the quilt with his free hand. Mary and Lydia were awake and began chattering as though they hadn't seen each other for a year. Hey, Maddie suddenly remembered. Mary and I heard the scariest noise last night. It sounded like wolves or something. Oh, yeah, Lydia said. Did they go like this? Yip, 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 yip. Her voice quavered in perfect imitation of the wild voices they had heard. Yes, Mary answered, just like that. What were they? Coyotes. Didn't they scare you the first time you heard them? No, I was a brave little girl. Oh, you were not, Mary pushed her shoulder. She probably climbed into bed with Mother, Maddie added. No, I didn't. I just covered up my head and lay real still. I didn't wake anybody. How would you like to be out on the open prairie like I was with nothing between you and them but a wagon and a little old campfire? Jake asked. You probably shinnied up inside the wagon when you heard them, Mary teased him. No, I didn't. I just covered up my head, too, and wished they would go away. My, but you were a brave little boy, Mary clicked her tongue. It was so good to be together again that Maddie didn't mind the close quarters in this seemingly God-forsaken country. Mother and Polly asked them to come and eat breakfast, so the girls hurriedly folded the quilts and piled them in a corner. Where do Tobe and Nettie live? Maddie asked. Over that way on the neighbor's land, Father pointed to the east. They're renting a house there. You mean there are houses around here? She asked. Of course, he answered. We're not the only people on this land. Well, you couldn't tell it by looking. Oh, Maddie, it's not that bad, Dan chuckled. There's a lot more going on around here than coyotes howling. They laughed, and all too soon breakfast was over and it was time to get to work. There was so much work to be done that they hardly knew where to begin. Father had built Dan and Polly's house since arriving and dug a hole in the ground for theirs. Now he was ready to begin on the top part. Building into the ground helped to keep the house cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Adobe blocks would be laid for walls, and then the roof was made of lumber overlaid with a thick layer of sod. Maddie wondered how it would be done, but did not have long to wait to find out. You girls come on out to the Buffalo Hollow as soon as you're done with your work here in the house, Father instructed them. Gittle, hitch Nellie up to the disc and bring her out. Maddie, Mary, and Lydia hurriedly washed the dishes and straightened the kitchen. Although it was small and only one window on the west end, Polly had whitewashed the walls, and it was bright and cheery. The Buffalo Hollow was a place in the prairie where buffalo had dug a hole in the sod and water had collected. When the girls arrived, they found Father hard at work driving Nellie and the disc through the water. Father had cut prairie grasses and hauled them to the hollow. Now he made a thick, grassy mud. He plodded back and forth until he was satisfied it was of the right consistency. Lydia showed her sisters the wooden molds Father had made. They were a foot square and 6 inches deep. She soaked them in the water tank, then piled them into the wheelbarrow to take back to the hollow. There she showed them how to pack the forms hard and tight and lay them in the sun to dry. When they had dried only a little, just enough to hold their shape, she dumped the block out onto the grassy slope. There the blocks would dry for several days until they were as hard as rock. These were top-quality adobe blocks, the best material around from which to build a house. All the long day, Maddie, Mary, and Lydia soaked the molds, carried them back to the hollow, filled and packed them with the thick grassy mud, then dumped them out onto the grassy slope. The sun beat down mercilessly, but still they worked. By evening their hands were rough and sore and their faces burned from the hot sun, but it would be worth all the work just to have a nice house of their own. Several days later, Father began the actual building of the house. He would need a minimum amount of lumber, so Tobe, Dan, Giddle, and 2 neighbor boys, Harry and Ezra, left early one morning long before sunrise. It was a long day's journey by horse and wagon to the mountains, where there was a lumber mill. They would need to spend the night there and come home the next day, not arriving until long after dark. Maddie felt uneasy about their going, but she knew they really had no other choice. Lumber was scarce, and they were fortunate to live close enough to the mountains to be able to get it. After breakfast, Father had another job for the girls to do. There was a beautiful plant growing on the prairie with fern-like leaves and lovely purple and yellow flowers. But alas, it was the loco weed, a poisonous plant. Cows and horses loved it, but could quickly eat enough of it to destroy their minds. So Maddie, Mary, and Lydia took shovels and the wheelbarrow and walked far and wide over the prairie, digging up the beautiful loco weeds and piling them on the ground. In the evening, they burned them there. It was almost hard to imagine that something so beautiful could be so dangerous. At sunset, when they walked past their new house, they saw that Father was nearly finished with the outside walls. It looked small in comparison to the large 2-story house he had built in Kansas. Because the floor of the house was dug into the ground several feet, the walls were only about 5 feet high on the outside. There was one window on the west end and a door on the east end. There would be 3 bedrooms, one for the 3 girls, one for Giddle and Jake, and one for Mother and Father. Then there would be a big room that would serve as kitchen, dining room, and living room. All looked dark and drab now, but the girls hoped it would look nicer once they had their furniture in and the walls whitewashed as Polly had. They walked on to Dan's house to begin the evening chores and help Mother and Polly get supper. Jake was sitting outside with his chair leaning back against the house. As they approached, he began lazily whistling a tune. "Listen to him," Lydia scoffed. "Hey, Lazybones, what have you been doing all day?" Mary called to him. He didn't bother to answer, but continued whistling and watching the sunset. "Lazybones," Maddie called. "Hey, Lazybones!" But still he did not answer. The 3 sisters decided to call to him together. "Lazybones!" By now they were standing directly in front of him, their hands cupped over their mouths. Bending down, they looked into his twinkling eyes. "Did you say something?" he asked innocently. "Yes! We'd like to talk with Lazybones!" Maddie yelled. "He's not here." "Yes, he is," they said in unison. "Don't you do anything besides nothing all day?" Mary chided him. "No, I did nothing besides nothing all day today. Do you want to trade places?" "Of course," Mary said. She grabbed him by the arm and tried to pull him out of his chair. "I'd like to sit here and whistle all day, every day for once, and do nothing besides nothing." "Go ahead." Jake stood up to give her his chair. "We'll see how long you can sit there and do nothing." She leaned her head back against the rough adobe blocks and began whistling a lively tune. "Go get us chairs, Jake. That looks like fun," Maddie told him. "Get your own chairs if it's so much fun," he replied. She gave him a playful kick, and he returned it. Then she shoved him toward the door. He pushed her back hard and nearly threw her over. "Unlately," meaning unbearable, she said. "I think if you are that strong, then you can dig up loco weed and we girls can sit here in the shade and watch you." "So that's what's wrong with you girls tonight. You've had too much of the loco weed," he replied, sounding as though he had discovered a gold mine. They looked at each other and burst out laughing. Yeah, we've had too much loco weed. After supper, they pulled chairs outside to sit in the cool breeze until bedtime. I bet you wish you could have gone with the other boys, Maddie said to Jake sympathetically. I sure do, he answered. I don't, she said. You don't what? I don't wish you were with them, and I'm glad I'm not with them either. You're scared of wolves. Not really, but you never know who or what you'll meet in this wild country on a night like this, with no moon and all. Even the stars aren't out tonight. What difference does that make? I don't know. After a few minutes, she added, I'm just glad I'm here and not there. I think it would be fun to go up in the mountains and camp like the cowboys. Not me. I'm not a cowboy and I'm not a cowgirl. I'm just a plain Amish girl that likes to stay at home. They should be coming home before too long. Jake looked toward the mountains in the north. There was only a smudge of blackness on the horizon. Their conversation turned to other things, and Dan, Tobe, and Giddle were soon forgotten. Suddenly they heard a strange noise coming from the north. It was a drumming sound, like many horses running, and a creaking and squealing like a wooden wagon being pulled too fast. They jumped up and strained to see what it could be. As the noise drew closer, they saw the dim shapes of two horses approaching at breakneck speed. Another horse and wagon was rumbling and careening across the prairie behind them, dust flying and lumber bouncing. Two horses, with Giddle and Tobe riding low over their necks, galloped into the yard and whirled to a stop in front of the makeshift barn. Then the wagon came thundering into the yard, and Dan and the neighbor boys, Ezra and Harry, jumped off it and ran to the house. Not stopping to tie the horses or to explain, they pushed past the girls and Jake and burst through the door. They stood against the stove, breathing hard and trembling. Boys, Mother exclaimed. It's wolves, they shouted. But the horses, Father reminded them as he rose to his feet. Tobe and Giddle are out there in the barn, they explained breathlessly. But Nellie and Cap are running around the yard, still pulling the wagon. You're going to have a runaway yet. Tobe and Giddle will get them, Dan insisted. Don't go out there, Father. The wolves are right behind us. When Maddie and Jake heard this, they quickly stepped inside the house. Mary and Lydia crowded in too and slammed the door shut. Father pulled on his boots and, despite Dan's warning, ran out of the house and to the barn. Those inside the house could hear him shouting, Wow! Woo! Get on! To scare the wolves away, and they had to chuckle in spite of themselves. I tell you, it isn't funny, Dan insisted. Those wolves were right behind us all the way from the mountains to here. We were so afraid we wouldn't make it before they attacked us. His breathing was still labored, and he found it hard to talk. I don't know why we didn't take the gun along. Why did they follow you? Jake asked. Dan, Ezra, and Harry looked at each other. None of them spoke for some time. Finally, Dan began the story. Well, we were piddling around this afternoon. We spent some time sightseeing and climbed a mountain. It started getting dark before we got back to the horses, so it was late when we started for home. We were still coming out of the mountains when we heard a wolf call. Just then the door opened, and Tobe and Giddle entered with Father soon following. They sank into the kitchen chairs, white-faced and shaken, and asked for something to eat. Mother hurriedly set bowls around for them and put a large kettle of bean soup on the table. Come, boys, she motioned to Dan, Harry, and Ezra. You can tell us the rest while you eat. They wasted no time in sitting to the table. A bear had taken their meat the night before and left them with nothing to eat all day. After they bowed their heads in silent prayer, Mary urged them to continue the story. Did you tell them you answered the wolf's call? Dan asked Tobe. Tobe chuckled. I guess we'll know better next time. That's for sure, Harry said. Why? What happened? Mary wanted to know. Toad picked up the reporting. When we answered their calls, they started to get closer and closer. Soon, we realized they were following us, and the horses got scared. Before we knew it, they began running for all they were worth. We couldn't hold them back, and the faster the horses went, the faster the wolves came. They were so close we could see their teeth. I tell you, we were running for our lives. Yeah, and the wagon was bouncing so bad we were afraid it might tear up, Dan added. If it would have broken up, we would have been sunk, Harry said. He took another serving of soup and asked for more water. Mother refilled their glasses and began heating more milk. It was obvious they would soon have the bowl of bean soup emptied. She stirred some flour into a beaten egg to make ribbles, small clumps that tasted like noodles when cooked. She added them to the hot milk. Where are the wolves now? Maddie asked. I think they turned around and went back when the boys stopped here, Father said. I didn't hear anything when I was outside. But by the way the horses were shaking, I know they weren't running from their imagination. I doubt that the wolves meant to attack them. They just thought it was a friendly race. Friendly race, Toad snorted. They didn't sound very friendly to me. Well, I really don't think they intended to eat you up, Father reassured them. Maybe not us, but they would have attacked the horses. In any case, we'd sure rather be having supper at home than being supper for the wolves. Father did not argue. He knew that the boys had been badly frightened. That evening, as Maddie lay in bed and tried to sleep, she thought about the wolves alone on the prairie. They were probably jogging back to their dens or nests or wherever wolves sleep, and thinking about the wild goose chase they had just had. At least, she thought, life is not boring here in New Mexico. If it isn't pleasant, at least it's exciting. End of chapter 11.